Hi everyone, daily.dev episode number 31, if I'm not wrong. And we have been doing this for a while, and this is a series of webinars when we have amazing speakers. We have a topic, and the topic today is probably one of the favorite ones especially for daily.dev, because it will be about developer tools. So I'll put some shameless plug here, but you'll forgive me. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining. You know, that's a cool intro. I checked this like so many times, but every time it's perfect way to get started. Nice. So before we start, some check with all the three amazing speakers. We have Tom, Sid, and Ceora. Hi, everyone. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Nice. Perfect. So again, let me explain fast, quick one. What is this? So we'll have 1 hour and a half. We'll stay together for 1 hour and a half. We'll have 3 presentations. We around 25 minutes each. So 25 minutes plus 5 minutes of Q&A. So usually we take the questions during the presentation, and at the end you can ask whatever you want. So just be active in the chat, say hi, make some noise here. Adarsh and Frostbite and many people here already. So nice. So I think that we can start. So we'll go in order. So we'll have Tom first, then Sid, and then last but not least, Ceora, of course. So bye, Sid and Ceora, and see you later. Bye-bye. So let me remove the right people. Sometimes I remove the wrong ones, so that's kind of embarrassing as a
I
host.
made the cut.
Nice, yes. So Tom Raviv, Raviv Tom on Twitter, and you are from Israel. Are you from Tel Aviv or another part of Israel?
I live in Tel Aviv. I was born and raised in a small suburb not that far from it. But
Nice.
yeah, been here for over 10 years now.
Yes, so daily.dev, let's say, it's a remote company, but we met in Tel Aviv. I've been in Tel Aviv some months ago. It was March and also April last year. So I've been in Tel Aviv already 2 times. But yes, very beautiful city, a bit hot, but also Rome is hot now, so I'm not missing that.
Everywhere's hot right now.
There is a heat wave, so more than 40 degrees here in Rome. So I'm happy that I'm in my house with AC and everybody else. So hi everyone. By the way, see many people here. So Tom, you work at Codux, and you also have some swag there. Is that the logo? Is that the Codux logo?
Yeah. I'm right. Wearing the duck with pride.
Nice.
Yeah, actually working for Wix. Codux is kind of like a little startup within Wix that runs independently and is not related to any of the existing editors or platforms that people might have engaged with up to this point. But we'll talk a little bit about that as we kind of go along.
Nice. Yes, I checked this and today, and also I'm a big fan of Wix. I know Amanda, we met many times. I've been invited at a Wix dinner, so yeah, there's also planning some collaborations. So, and we also have Codux in the chat. So probably, I don't know if it's you, but probably it's an AI generated system that is here in the chat. So as you can see, we are evolving super fast. So Tom, your presentation, Seeing is Believing, Secret to Better, Faster, and More Intuitive Coding, right?
Yep.
Nice. So when you want, you can share your screen or do whatever you want, because I think we'll have, because we have a professional now here, so please share your screen or do your thing, and then basically I'll remove myself, I'll kick myself, and then I'll jump. We can really start. Nice.
So I do this, and I do this, and
perfect.
I think we are good.
Nice. Okay, so perfect, and see you in 20-25 minutes. Bye, Tom, and best of luck. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Okay. So, hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Seeing is Believing, a visual is worth 1,000 words. And today we'll talk a little bit about kind of where do visuals play a part in the flow of our development. But before we actually get started with that, just a quick word about myself and my 2 fat cats. So I've been with Wix for a long time. Just celebrated my 10-year anniversary not long ago. Started off as a script kiddie, kind of finding my way, learning a lot, and moved up through the ranks, did various different projects, different teams, jumped around. And these days, I head developer relations for a product called Codux, which you will hear a little bit about today, as well as serve as a team lead for one of our open source projects, which is called Stylable. And that is a CSS preprocessor that we have developed in-house here. But that's a conversation for another day. As mentioned, I am located in Tel Aviv, Israel. We too are suffering from an unbelievable heat wave, and very glad to be here inside the air-conditioned room. As far as, just a little bit about myself. So a big D&D aficionado. I think at this point I have over 1,500 hours of Critical Roles watched. And yeah, these are two of my cats that I'm raising with my partner, which we love very much despite their humongous size. A quick plug. So yeah, Codux is what we're working on. Codux is a brand new offering by Wix. But this one is purely for developers and for professional audiences. It's brand new. We only released our public beta about 7-8 months ago. It is completely free to try and use. And the idea there is that Codux provides Wix's accumulated know-how of visual experiences and visual editing and brings that over to pure code, pure React and TypeScript projects, letting you run it on your machine. We consider it to be a visual IDE. So just like any IDE, you would download it, you would install it, and you would use it to open up your projects and to kind of work on those visually. We'll see a couple of examples that Codux is relevant for as well, but most of the talk will be talking about visuals in general. The QR code on screen, of course, you can scan that. If you do, you'll get all of our links to download Codux, to try it out, to join our community on Discord, to follow us on Twitter, all of that good stuff. Okay, so getting started. Usually, when we want to do something, and when we want to do something good, we want to solve a problem. And we're going to start with a real-life problem. In this case, this problem. I don't know if any of you are familiar with this video, but it stresses me out so much. It's madness. It's dangerous. This is a very famous crossing from Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, and I would not want to drive there. And the thing is that it doesn't have to be this way. We know that other places and other crossings have worked it out. If we take a look at this one, for example, it's super smooth, it's super nice. The rules are clear. People know what to do, and the chances of being surprised or caught kind of red-handed are a lot lower. So how can we actually accomplish this? How can we have a system that kind of works a little bit better towards all of its users? So let's break it down into a couple of things that have really made this better. And we're going to obviously focus on the visual side of things here. So the first thing that we need to do is to kind of set the stage, right? Everyone needs to know what's allowed and what isn't allowed. Where am I allowed to go? Where am I not supposed to be? And by marking the lanes on the road and kind of creating that very clear, that very distinct separation of where I am and what I'm allowed, order is manifested. But that's not all of it. It's also about sending clear signals. The system or other users can signal to us whether it is our turn to go, whether it's our turn to stop, and what we should be doing in terms of how the system views us as users to kind of get the best result out there. But it's also important to remember that we're not all the same, right? Not everyone processes visual signals in the same way. And so if you look at this example without color, it's a lot harder to know if this is telling you to go, to stay, what should be done. And so the first thing we can learn about sending clear signals is that visuals have a multitudinous to them. They can be comprised of more than one thing. And here we can see that it's not just color. It's also the shape, and it's also the position within the screen light. Visuals are also a really nice place to play around, to have a little bit of fun. It's okay to be clear. It's important to be clear, to signal to our users what we expect to happen. But it's also nice to kind of provide that little bit of extra. If somebody has to be standing there and waiting, why not send them some love? Make them smile while they're waiting before the next light tells them where to go. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is that this game has rules, and we all know them. And what do I mean by that? A couple of things. The first is that in order to get on the road, in order to drive a car, we need to have a license, first of all. We need to study the theory of what's allowed, what are the rules, what are the regulations, so that we know kind of what to do on the road. But also, the cars themselves are regulated in terms of what they have to offer in terms of communication to the user. And they need to be able to do that in a very brief and succinct manner when time and focus is a critical issue. Now, learning to drive is somewhat basic. Most of us have done it. Most of us can do it. But if you take that to the next step, if you have a user that has dedicated themselves to learning the system, to learning the rules of the game, to learning what they are actually using and what they are supposed to do, then all of a sudden, the possibilities are much, much greater. So if a car deals with 2 dimensions, a plane would deal with 3. And that increases complexity in a significant manner that would require probably multiple years of studying in order to be able to master this system. Okay, so we had road markings to kind of reduce confusion and disorientation to help us know how to stay within the line. These create clear guidelines that are easy to learn. We have traffic signals that increase the overall system effectiveness by telling each person or each entity where to go, when to go, and to kind of smooth out all of the kinks if the system has any. This also makes the system easier to tweak. If we found out in the problematic example that one of the lanes or one of the sides that traffic is coming from is more burdened than others, dealing with that would not be a simple case. But if you already have traffic stoplights, then you can just play around with the timing of those. And as you do, you can change the system to serve exactly the use cases you want. And you can even have that be sort of dynamic, depending on hours, depending on necessity, and so on. And lastly, licensing and training. We're increasing the user confidence about what they are expecting from the system, what sort of signals and communications they are looking for. And by that, we are reducing their stress and letting them work in the best way possible. Okay, so that's a real-life problem that has a proven record of possible solutions to it. But I can already hear you saying, but my real world is virtual, right? We're working with code. We're developing things all the time. This is what our aesthetic looks like. Can you see that div over there with the red background? I wish it was centered. And that's where, even in the realm of code and in the realm of software development, there are all sorts of areas or all sorts of domains where we can provide greater understanding. And I think the first area like that is insights, right? We spend so much more time reading code and trying to understand it as opposed to actually writing it. The picture on screen is Margaret Hamilton, one of the developers who was working on the Apollo project. That is the source code for said project. And can you imagine trying to read that, trying to comprehend what that code does, following it line by line, page by page, black on white? It sounds absolutely ridiculous to me. And also, side note, I found out that Margaret coined the term software engineering, which was very cool to learn. Okay, so how can we improve our insights and our reading comprehension? Okay, so a little story. I was sitting with a friend a couple of weeks ago, and I had a screen similar to this on my computer. Now, this friend is not a developer. He's not from the tech scene, nothing like that. And they saw my screen and had a visceral reaction. Like, it made them queasy. It made them uneasy. And this is really hard to grasp. This is really hard to parse. But luckily for us, there's a magic button. And when you click that magic button, all of a sudden, everything gets syntax highlighting. Everything gets the proper indentation. Now, this code might still be minified or uglified or all sorts of things that make it hard to understand. But at least in terms of the visuals of it, in terms of trying to understand the scope, where we are, what's happening, this has made it so much easier. And I think it's also important to remember that this sort of behavior is not limited to code. It's not limited to your IDE. It's not limited to the browser. It also exists within your tools. So I'm usually on my day-to-day machine running on Linux, Arch, by the way. And when you update your dependencies, when you update your packages, your operating system on Arch, it used to look kind of like this. And every time I would do this, like every couple of days, and I would look at all of the changes that came and try to understand what happened. And then a couple of weeks ago, they pushed a change. They pushed a feature. And now it looks like this. And this has made my life so much easier. It's so much clearer to see what has changed. Whether one of these updates is dangerous to me, or I consider it to be dangerous and might break something on my machine. Whether one of them might fix a bug in a specific part of the system that I was experiencing. This really, really, really helped my experience of maintaining my development machine. So color and layouting are a huge, huge factor in all of this. Another thing is trying to sort of see the forest for the trees. And I think the more complex a project gets, the more intricate, and especially the more stakeholders it has, the more people are contributing to it and are touching the code, manipulating it, adding features, creating branches, going crazy. Visualizing all of that breadth of work across the entire system can be tricky. So in this view, we can see an example of a tree visualization for Git branches. This can give me a very clear understanding of what I am doing, what state is my system, my branch, my project currently at? Where am I in relation to other changes that have been introduced to this project? And trees exist in many places. They are fantastic graphical representation. We have a file tree. I'm not sure that I've encountered a better representation of files and directories other than a tree since like the 80s. And even within the outline of our code, right? If we want to just be able to see kind of like the headlines, the main pieces that are taking part, that are playing their part, then that gives us a view into that as well. In Codux, we took this a step further. So here you can see Codux on stage. We're working on a component, in this case, the main app component. And in Codux, you would find what we call the elements panel. And this panel is similar to the DOM inspector that you might find in the browser, but it provides additional insights. Codux is able to look at your source code and at the runtime at the same time, and to kind of bridge those two together. So you would see things like children and expressions and repeaters and conditionals and all sorts of stuff that were in your source code. And the runtime, they would have been computed out already. A repeater would have turned into at least a list of nodes. But we're able to kind of signify those parts, give them a distinct visual ID, and represent them in a tree for you to be able to play with. And I think it's also important to remember that when it comes to a project, to a software project, the code might be the main part or the most important part, but there are many other parts as well. Many projects also find themselves managing their workflow or their process or their release schedule or bug priorities or all sorts of stuff like that in additional external tooling. And that could be using spreadsheets, that could be using docs, that could be using all sorts of systems. But even in those places, it's important to kind of keep that distinct visual identity as a part of it. Here, in this example on screen, it's very easy for me to understand which process is dependent on which process, and at what point in time is it supposed to be incorporated into our work. Next up, once we've kind of gotten that insight down, meaning we understand the code around us, we're able to navigate through it, and we're able to see all of the things that we want to. Next come the effectiveness. Okay, so we want to make a change, and we want to pick the best tool out there for that particular job. And I think it's as software developers, we're really lucky that we belong to a family of craftsmen or engineer that have the benefit of being able to create better tooling for themselves. You can think of a blacksmith or a carpenter that are able to do the same thing. They can use their skill set and their tools to create new tools that would allow them to do better work faster and easier. So that's kind of where we are with effectiveness. We constantly have the ability to generate new tools for ourselves or to pick the best tool out there for the job. Okay, so an example, if we're looking at something, some common action, let's say that a piece of text would have settings, it would have a size, family, color, bold, and so on. Which example is easier to understand? Which example is easier to change? We've all gotten so used to this rich text toolbar, this concept of quickly manipulating text. And even without manipulating, just looking at it, it's incredibly clear what the state of the text being edited is right now. And in other cases, where they might not be as common, but they can be a lot more complex. If we look at box shadow, for example, there are 6 parameters that go into determining what a box shadow would look like. And trying to guess what one of those would do on their own is reasonable, I'd say. Trying to guess in advance what all of those combined together, mixed together with different values would look like requires a lot of experience. And even at that point, I think people would still frequently get it wrong. And so having a clear tool that allows us to play with these values, to change them, and to see the output that we're working on change in real time really provides us with a lot of understanding and increased efficiency. Rulers are kind of like that as well, in that space is important. When we get a design and the designer would like us to implement that pixel perfect, there's a reason for that. They've made an effort, they've focused hard into creating that design, and that design is balanced, and all of the pieces of that UI sort of play together and come together to tell a story. And it's hard to predict in advance what a certain space might look like, especially as we're kind of moving values over between programs. So like, it's possible that Figma or other design tools would give you values that are not exactly what you would need to put in the browser at the end of the day, just to have that visual output that you were looking for. So here you can see Codux provides you the ability to kind of see all of that, all of those elements kind of come together and where they are in relations to each other. Visual tools are also a great place to reduce room for mistakes. So if you have some sort of process, something that might be a little bit more dangerous, or something that happens a little bit more rarely, I think that there's a true benefit to having that sort of be wrapped up in a tool, in a visual tool even. And if we're looking at this, for example, let's say that this would run some major tests flow, some very expensive action, or it would deploy something to production. By selecting things from my UI here, the chances that I'll do a mistake, just a typo or something like that, are greatly reduced. And after we've done our change, right? We've manipulated whatever we wanted, we added a feature, we closed the bug. There's a question of sanity. Is the system where we want it to be? Is everything functioning in the way that it should? And I think for that sanity, it's really, really nice to be able to find problems closest to the source. So here you can see 2 examples of that. One is the infamous squiggly line In this case, TypeScript, telling us that this component is expecting some sort of prop that wasn't passed to it. Something is missing, something is incorrect. And I'm getting that visual cue immediately in my source code. Next to it, we can see an example of Wallaby, which is a test runner that runs in your IDE and kind of constantly runs the test as you're doing the work. And so if you've made a change and something broke, you'll see that immediately as well. The DevTools give us a very similar experience where we need to have the ability to tie a specific visual to a specific node or computed value. We're all familiar with this button. It's a lifesaver. And that really gives us the ability to kind of choose what we want and to drill in on that. Codux provides you with a similar ability. You're able to select anything you want on stage. And then on the right side, through the panel, you'll see all of the computed values. The only difference here compared to the browser DevTools is that from any one of those values, you could jump directly over to, say, the styles panel to edit those under the correct selector with the correct value and have that be incorporated into your source code without needing to copy things from the browser after you've kind of played around with them a little bit. And reality is complex. We often find ourselves needing to understand it better, to kind of dig into it. Debugging can be really, really tricky. The more complex the system is, the more moving parts there are, the harder it is to understand. And the timeline view through our performance handling is a great way of doing that. And just to kind of give you more and more options, then it has the call tree or the flame graph or the stack charts. It has all of those different views that you can use in order to find the best visualization to understand kind of what's going on. And lastly, sorry, one before, it's also nice to kind of be able to see your work, to see your changes across an entire project. For that, having demos or a very rich documentation or even a playground provides you with a lot of flexibility in terms of seeing different components in different states and seeing how they were changed and if that change was intended. And we've mentioned tools that exist outside of your code. It's not different with Sanity. Here also, we have all sorts of monitoring systems, all sorts of tools that provide us with insight into understanding the state of the system to make sure that nothing's on fire, everything's working, everybody's happy, and users are getting the experience that they expect. To wrap those three up, so visuals can help us with insight. As mentioned, we spend most of our time reading code and trying to understand code. Visuals are a great guide in doing that. Effectiveness. Any specific or repetitive tasks can benefit from having specific tooling that let you kind of work in one spot and do that change quickly and with the intent you wanted. And lastly, sanity. Debugging is an expensive action. Any sort of hints, any sort of guides that we can get, then the better it is. Okay, so just a couple of takeaways before I wrap up. Benefits of using visual tools. They let us process information faster. They let us manipulate outputs, especially visual outputs, with ease. We really believe that when you're working on visual things, it's better to do so in a visual environment. And it allows you to expose specific issues or errors in a way that is best communicated to the user. And I invite you all to remember these points, remember these benefits the next time you're working on a tool, whether it's a CLI, whether it's a script, whether it's an entire application or framework. Think about what visual cues you can give to reduce complexity and data overload, to help identify patterns within the use of that project, to detect any anomalies, to communicate what you want, and to really give the user the best means of exploring their data. Thank you all so much. And if we have time for questions, then I'll be glad to answer any.
Nice, amazing. So thank you so much, Tom. I wanted to jump in when you say that you are a D&D fan, because not many people know this, but I learned to read with a D&D manual. This is another story, probably not for tech, but I
That's
played
amazing.
D&D basically for most of my life since version 1.0. So kind of old. I
Okay,
just
so we
disclaimed
need to
my
have a
age.
conversation about that.
Absolutely have one for sure. By the way, let's go back to this. So first of all, thank you so much for the presentation. It was very clean. Now we have still the Codux account here. And yes, roll for initiative, amazing. So nice. I need to find a way to connect this was my old passion to tech, and then that probably to connect with some more friends, maybe play online one day. So we have some questions. Thank you, of course. You feel free, of course, to drop your thoughts about the presentation. So we have some questions about some generic ones, some more about the Codux IDE too. So I think that this was about, this is by Vlad. They said, like, if the React component is represented as a tree, what about CSS? I think that he is asking more like about something in React, I think.
So I think when you're talking about visualizing things, then you can visualize them in a lot of ways. And I think the next conversation, the next talk that we're going to have here from Sid is going to talk about ASTs, which I love dearly and have used extensively. And even there, in that sort of realm, you can represent components, you can represent CSS, you can represent most programming really as an AST. And an AST is beautifully visualized using a tree. So even in that sort of place, if you're having a very complex style sheets and it has all these rules and selectors and media queries and everything's kind of nested, and CSS has even its own nesting right now. So yeah, you could totally create a visualization for CSS in a similar manner. And in Codux, we do actually process a lot of those things kind of under the hood in exactly that way. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I think so. So, Vlad, if you're still there, just let us know if that was okay for you. And so, I want to be honest for you, Tom, not hate me, but I never tried the Codux. So this could be like something good or bad, but like because I want to try it. So they're asking if there is like, is this like a sort of like standalone IDE? How does it work? So if you can give a little view, is there a plugin? Like how is it structured? What's the idea?
So the idea there is very similar to any IDE you're already using, right? If you're using VS Code or Vim or WebStorm or what have you, it's an application that you download. We support Windows, Mac, and a variety of Linux distributions. You install it on your machine and you open local projects just like you would in any other IDE. Once you've done that, essentially, it's a browser and an IDE kind of mixed together with an assortment of visual tools that we feel provide a good experience in working with that. It's not supposed to be a replacement for your IDE. For anything that has to do with business logic or, kind of developing more intense programmatic side of things, keep to your IDE, keep to your Copilot. Those things are wonderful, and we're not trying to kind of get those out of the picture. But we really do feel that when you're working with visual outputs, then when you're doing layouting, you're doing styling, you're doing composition, you're doing all kinds of work like that, where you're building UIs, then it has a lot of value to work in a one-stop shop that lets you see the thing, change the thing, and validate the thing all in one place without having to jump from the source code to the browser, to back to the source code, and maybe to an external tool to let me generate that shadow that I wanted, and like so on and so on.
Nice, thank you. When I'll try it out, of course, I'll let you know. So probably this can be an excuse, so we can mix D&D call plus Codux. I don't know. We can find a way to.
We'll find a way. We'll find a way.
Have a good discussion. Yes. I haven't played.
And I think it's it's really important for me to state that as mentioned, Codux is in public beta. It is completely free to use, no strings attached. It has no proprietary formats, no vendor lock-in of any sort. So really, you can try it out. If you don't like it, you can stop using it. Your project is yours. Your code is yours. It goes with you. We are all about feedback. We want people to tell us, does it help you? Does it serve the function that we imagine it to, that we want it to? And if you have any ideas of how to make it better, then I welcome any and all to join our Discord, follow us on Twitter, and come talk to us. We're really excited about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I left the link in the chat. Maybe I'll do this even later. We have the link of Tom even in the description. So Discord, the Twitter account, and so on. I showed everything.
Thanks so much.
Nice. Okay, so the last one, and then I think it's time for Sid, which is already ready. So if we cloned other open source project, I don't know if this is about Codux, I think. Can we import the project into this tool and check code functionality visual-wise? I don't know if he's talking about Codux or something during the presentation too.
I'll answer as if he's talking about Codux and hope that he is, because that's just the way I best understand it. So yeah, you can open any project using Codux. So for example, just in our most recent release, we've put some extra effort to make the Blueprint component library kind of look and feel a little bit better in Codux. But essentially, if a project is using React and TypeScript and like CSS or Sass or Tailwind or an assortment of styling solutions that we support, then you could open it in Codux and you'd be able to see those components graphically, visually, and to play around, select, edit to your heart's content.
Nice. Thank you so much, Tom. So this was an amazing presentation, and so best of luck for everything. And yes, we are done. So thank you. If you want to stay with us at the end, I'll invite you again. Otherwise, if you're busy,
I'm
no
sticking
worries.
around. I'm sticking around. Thank you so much for having me.
Perfect. Thank you. So now let me remove Tom and let me invite Sid. So Sid, hi.
Hello.
Hey there. So we have Siddharth Kshetrapal. No, Kshetrapal.
Close enough. I'll take it.
Okay. So I'm sorry, but usually I test this before the presentation. I didn't do with your last name, Sid. I'm sorry. So you worked at OutZero, Code Sandbox. Now you work at GitHub. Right? But you have a PhD in physics, right?
That's true, yeah. I have a master's in physics, yeah.
Nice. So many people, even because I also worked for the European Space Agency, and we work like with software, but many people, they were graduated in physics. So physicians probably will conquer the world one day. So, so Sid, please introduce yourself and then let us know when we want me to share your screen, and then introduce the presentation, and then I'll let you start.
All right. I think that's a very good introduction already. I'm Siddharth, but you can call me Sid, and I work in the design systems team at GitHub. I live in Amsterdam, which you can't see outside my window, but it's daytime. And yeah, I'm excited to talk about ASTs because I am a physics graduate. I didn't study this stuff. I discovered it very late, and it's super interesting.
Nice, thank you. Can I tell me when I can share the screen? By the way, I'll also share a link of the presentation, so in the chat as soon as this will start. Let me check this. Yes. Can I share this one? Perfect. Nice. So best of luck with this. See you in around 20-25 minutes. So we'll also have a Q&A session at the end. Drop your questions in the chat, so we'll take them at the end. Best of luck, Sid, and see you later. Bye-bye.
Yeah. All right. So as I said, I'm Sid. I work in design systems at GitHub. This is my Twitter handle if you'd like to listen to some garbage. And I'm going to talk about abstract syntax trees and building tiny tools for yourself. Focus on the tiny tools for yourself part. So this is the link for the slides. There are a bunch of links that I opened. So if you want to follow along, this is a this will give you the slides right now. And I did not study any of this. I didn't study computer science, I studied physics, but I realized that if I can learn ASTs, I can also teach you a little bit about ASTs, not to make you an expert, but hopefully get you excited to try these things. So let's start with a demo. I have a local version of the GitHub docs running on my machine. And let's see. All right, so there's this page, right? And I don't really work on GitHub docs a lot. I work on the design system. So when I want to make changes here, the hardest part for me is to like find where is this file, because there's so much code at GitHub. And even things like I can search for guides, but it's localized. So it wouldn't really give me the React JSX. It would give me a JSON file which has all the translations. So I built this thing where if you hold Option and you hover around, you see this boundary like border. And if I click on something, then it opens that specific file in VS Code. So for example, I think this, even though this is a heading, it feels very tiny. So I'm just going to pump it up a little. Yeah, this feels more like cool. I'm happy with that. Another thing that I noticed while playing around with the docs is that this menu opens, but it doesn't really have any transition. So it feels very rough. So again, I'll hold my Option key, hover around. If I click this part, it will open this exact component in the file. And you can see this is like nested somewhere deep. I wouldn't have found this like in 20 minutes. So it feels like this is rotate. I think I'm going to add a transition, and that should do it. Yeah, this looks much better. So what's really going on here is that each in dev mode, when I'm in my localhost server, I'm using a Babel plugin that adds context to each one of these files. For example, this header, you can see this is h1, it has whatever class, and then there's this extra attribute added called data source, which has a URL on my local machine. So it says docs GitHub landing hero page, line number 25. And then I have a tiny script that reads this and opens the file. So this is like a really practical way in which you can build a tiny tool like this for yourself to leverage ASTs. So let's look at how does this work. So in my Babel RC, I have the preset because this is the next website, and then I have this plugin called Babel plugin open source. I find it very funny because like it opens the source. And let me close this. The way this plugin works is that if you open the source code, there's a bunch of Babel plugins in the site. And if you open this one, it's actually just one main file. And what a Babel plugin looks like is this. There's a function which returns the name of the plugin and a visitor. Now, what is a visitor? This is where we kind of have to get into abstract syntax trees, or I'm just going to call it ASTs for now. So if you're looking at any code, your parser, your compiler, they don't look at code the same way. They read this code and then they create tokens out of it, and then they parse the tokens to create a mapping that looks very different from this. So for example, for the Babel parser, this is what the representation of this code looks like. So it's only 5 lines, but it's 403-line JSON. So it converts it into this JSON to parse it. And it's nicer to look at it in this view where you have a top-level file. Inside the file, you have a program. The whole thing is a program. And then inside the program, you have a body. And you see that when I hover over these, it highlights in the left. I'm going to zoom it a little. So there's an import declaration and export declaration. And then each one of these has more things. There's a specifier. There's a default specifier. It's almost nicer to watch this in form of a tree because it is a syntax tree. So very quickly, let's just go through this. It's very nerdy bits. Most of it is things that you can learn by looking at the tree. So this whole thing is my program. There are 2 statements in the program. There's an import declaration, which says import React from React. And then the way I've learned like the way I learned about making this diagram is literally just looking at what is inside my body, looking further inside it. So there's a specifier, and it's of type import default specifier. So this tells me that if I give a compiler import default, and if I gave it an identifier, like React in this case, it will figure out how to build this line. And that's kind of what's going on here. What's more interesting is on the right side, because you have a default declaration exported, and there's an assignment here. On the left side is home, which is this variable, and on the right side is an arrow function, which has its own function. So further down, the arrow function expression takes two things. It has params, that's one node, and this could have an array of parameters. In my case, it has none, and it has a body. So bodies can also be an array. In my case, it's just one, which is it's returning this JSX looking thing. And so this thing is wrapped. It's one node called JSX element. Each JSX element can have these three nodes: an opening element, children, and closing element. And so we're kind of interested in the opening element because that's where we put data source. And each opening element has an identifier. So the name is a JSX identifier with the value h1, and it can have an array of attributes. In this case, it would be JSX attributes with a name and value. A lot of terms, I know. But again, you don't have to understand all of these. The only thing you have to understand how to do is use AST Explorer. And I can hover on this, I can select it, and it would tell me where exactly it is. For example, this thing is a JSX identifier. This whole thing is a JSX attribute. That's what's important. Okay. So looking at these slides, the thing that we're interested in is JSX opening element. And what we really want to do is add another attribute which has data source and the URL for the file. We could ignore everything else in this. But it helps if you understand just that ASTs are trees and this is how they branch. Cool. So a visitor for Babel is any of these types. So it could be an import default specifier, it could be JSX opening element, it could be string literal. All of these are types that it can visit. So when you say, I want Babel to visit JSX opening element, it will walk through the tree, visit every JSX opening element, and call the function that you give it to call. So that's the basic structure of a Babel plugin. And then now what I'm doing is I looked at my AST Explorer and I want the JSX opening, this one. And you see that it has things like start and end, and it has a location which has starting line, column, index, which is kind of what I want. I want the file name, which comes from the state, and I want the exact location of this JSX opening element so that when I click in the browser, I know what file at which line to open. That's step one, figuring out the URL. Step two is to add an additional attribute. So what I'm doing is I'm creating an attribute. Babel lets you create new things on the fly. I'm creating a JSX attribute, which has a name and a value. Again, I'm looking at the AST, trying to figure out what it expects. Babel also has very good documentation. And so what I've done here is I added a new attribute called data source. I added a string literal called URL, and then I literally just pushed it into the attributes that the node has. And this is enough. Babel, if you manipulate the AST in this way, like I push an additional attribute, Babel will add it and save it when it compiles to the dist file. So that's very nice. There's some links here if you're following along, or if you want to look at it later. This link is for the slides. All of the links here work. So AST Explorer has a really cool thing where you can also enable transforms, and then you can test your visitor functions. For example, I wrote the one that I showed, I copied it here, and you can run it on the right, and you see that it added this data source attribute. If you'd like to look at the entire link, entire code of this plugin, it is on GitHub, it is open source. It's more lines than I showed, but most of it is just housekeeping. For example, if it's a fragment, then you can't add more attributes. And if you're not using VS Code, if you're using Sublime or something else, then Vim, then it handles all of those for you. So I'm going to move faster now. There are some other cool Babel ideas that I found that I'd like to share. Some of these are by me. This one is by Peter Ingram. And what this does is, if you have a console.log anywhere in your code, it adds the file name and the line number. So very similar in structure to what I showed you before, but it adds them to that console line statement so that when you see the console log, you write this, but this is what shows up in your console. So it tells you where it is. Very useful if you're bundling things and you want the original name. Another one that was very interesting was by this person whose handle is Evolify. And what they've done is they've kind of tried to bring some view-looking directive APIs into React. So if you write if and give it a variable, it actually converts that into a block like this. So this is what you would expect to write in React land. And this wouldn't work, but it would work if you write a Babel plugin, which converts this into this. Very cool. There's something that I made just for fun. It's called JSXO. So for my blog, when I added this to my blog, where if I create a file with just JSX or just HTML, it will transpile that and it will add an import statement, wrap it in a function, and export it. So it's almost like having a single file component, but without any of the boilerplate. And I could make it support variables. It's really interesting to play around with this. What syntax you would create for yourself if you just had like free reign. Finally, this is probably the most ambitious one that I have. So in this one, what I've tried to do is, if you're using CSS in JS, it parses the AST, finds that point where you're using it, creates a new CSS file, and then puts the class name back into the original file. So it's kind of trying to compile the CSS out. There are other projects like this, like Lenaria, Compiled, Panda CSS, which is new. They all work on very similar principles. So you can do a lot of things, like from really fun tools for yourself to better debugging environment to full-on library stuff. All right, so Babel plugins are great for build time changes. All of these were build time. But what if you want to change the source permanently? For example, there's some code that we had in the design system part or in the part of the design system. So we had a component called underline nav, and it also had a sibling child, another import that you have to do called underline nav item. Now, we realized that you would always need to use these together, and it made more sense for the API to have underline nav item as a child of underline nav. So we changed the API, we attached it, and we said everyone should rename underline nav item to underline nav item dot underline nav dot item. And then of course you don't need the additional import. So this is the diff, right? You could probably do this by just like a simple find and replace. But like our applications tend to be very composable. For example, this is totally a valid approach where you have underline nav item in this file and there is no underline nav because this is just the settings section and another component is importing the settings section to make the full nav. So even though we can replace the JSX here maybe, but if we remove this import, that wouldn't work. This needs to have the parent still imported. So it really depends on the context. Is the parent already imported? If it's not, then we should. If it's already imported, then we can safely remove. So we want a find and replace, but it should be very contextual. So something like parsing ASTs is a very good use case for this. And you could do it with Babel, where you compile the source back into the same place of the source. So you basically replace the source file, which would work. PS CodeShift is a good project. It's pretty old, but it's still pretty good. A new one that I really like is called PS Morph, and it's built with TypeScript in mind. So as a TypeScript, it uses the TypeScript AST and has very good types. So especially if you're transforming TSX files, then this one is really good. If you're working with this, what the code looks like is something like this. You create a new project with tsmorph. You could give your config file, it will import all the files from it, or you could manually feed it some files. And after you feed it files, when you say, give me back the source file, it will return the AST for each of those files. And then you can transform it. So the code looks something like this. You say, get descendants of kind. And AST Explorer also supports TypeScript. So I just changed my parser from Babel parser to TypeScript. And now it shows me TypeScript AST. So there's import, there's two import declarations. There's one variable statement here. The names are slightly different. And you'd see that this part is still going to be JSX related. Let's see. Inside the other function, inside the body, there's a JSX element. That's what we're interested in. And JSX elements have opening, children, and closing elements. So it seems familiar. What's really nice about this is that it's very well typed. So the moment you write this function, it gives you suggestions for all the syntax it supports. There are like 331 possible options that option node types. And we want JSX element. We figured that out. Now, when I say from the list of all of the JSX elements in this file, let's loop over them with for each. And then this should be of type CSS element, which means we can actually look at the type definition of this in TypeScript, brilliantly typed. And you get things like get JSX children, get opening element, get closing element. So there's a lot of functions that you might need, which are already there. I want opening element. And then I did the same thing. I looked at the types. Again, no compiler experience. I'm just looking at the types and trying to figure out what seems like the thing I want. And then I do some hit and trial. And I was able to get this far. So what I want is if opening tab node is called underline nav item, then replace it with text underline nav item dot item. Right? So this is the tiny switch that we want to make. And then if you're making it with the opening element, we should make it with the closing element as well. And then you call ast.save, and that will save the changes in the file. So this part is done. Now let's tackle the import. Again, I did get descendants of kind, syntax kind, and then I got all of these suggestions. I want import declaration. And then for each of the import declarations in the file, I can look at the definition. And this was slightly more interesting because I had to learn what the names are. So what I did was I just looked at these things and said, okay, there's an import statement. What is the first part called? I learned it's called an import clause. What's the second part called? It's called a module specifier. What if you import it not with star, but named imports? Those are called import clause, name binding. So a lot of these are interesting. And through this, I learned that what I want here is declaration.get module specifier. And if it's not my library, then I can just skip this import. And the first part, if I'm importing like this, if I'm importing by name, then I can get named imports. For each of these, I can loop. And then if it matches my thing that I want to remove, which is underline nav item, I can just call import specifier.remove. So very interesting. The case where it might not have the parent import already, so we don't want to import this entire line. What you can do is keep track of, is the parent imported? If it's not, then add an import declaration. Again, a lot of code here. If you want, you can look at the slides when you have more time to like slowly go through it. There's a link to edit this in Code Sandbox. You can run tsmorph inside Code Sandbox. You can play around with it. All right, so we talked about how Babel plugins can attach information at build time or manipulate code at build time. If you want to transform the source code, then tsmorph is really good at it. What if we added like a bonus server to connect these two? And that's kind of what I explored with this project called UI DevTools. Let me open demo on my local host. So I have this preview running. And when I inspect element, you'll see it's similar to what I did before, where, by the way, this is like class names from Tailwind. And then I have this data source where there's a file name. I also have things like, what is the class name type? And what is the start and end? Because what I've tried to do here is create like a tiny dev tool which understands Tailwind. So all of these options, when I modify, let's say, this border radius, these are just border radius from my Tailwind theme instead of everything that you would see in like a browser dev tool. So, and the most interesting part is, let's say, if I want to make this medium, you'd see that there's a network request to localhost. And what that does is it sends the payload that we attached with Babel. So it's sending the path, it's sending which line number it is, the attribute we're trying to change, and the new value of that attribute. Because I've basically created a node server that's talking to tsmorph. So if I, let's see, if I can pull that up, this is the code for this file. Yeah, there you go. This is the image with rounded MD. And now you see, if I change this to rounded full, it should also change in the code. Keep your eyes there. Right? So it changed. And it's almost instant. It's like 2 milliseconds, 3 milliseconds lag. That's how fast manipulating ASTs can be. And then you can really play around with it a little more. For example, if I want to manipulate the margin here, first of all, I don't know what margin 4 means. I don't use Tailwind a lot. So I need this visual approach to this. I find this more useful. And I am a very visual person. So what I find helpful is that I built this tiny like Figma style mover where I can move this. And when it feels comfortable to me, then I can say, okay, this is what I want. And then it will send the network request, save changes back, right? So that's the core idea here. I like how it really plays in nicely with the previous talk, where we do a lot of visual coding, and it helps to have visual tools for visual coding. So this is a very scientific diagram that I made, where if you have source code, you can run it through a Babel plugin for your dev mode and add tiny tools for yourself. This is where you build your tiny tools. And then those tiny tools can talk to a node server running on your machine, which can talk to tsmorph, which will change your source code. And then the cycle begins again, because you've created a continuous loop for yourself where if you manipulate the source code, it will trigger changes. It will trigger your server to run Babel on it again, and then you'll always have a fresh update loop. So this creates a very clean workflow. Last thing I have to say is like, it's not just for JavaScript. Every language creates an AST. Everything has a parser. So for example, for something like CSS, there's a bunch of parsers here. I'm using PostCSS. And again, AST Explorer, huge shout, brilliant tool. And this is what AST for CSS looks like. It's still a tree, but it's a very flat looking tree, because there's not a lot of nesting that happens. So for example, these are rules. Inside each rule, you have the selector. You have the location, of course, and then you have each one of these as a declaration. So I can go to the declaration and see, okay, this is the property, which is background color, and this is the value I'm giving. So what I really wanted to do with something like this is, because I work on a design system and we publish a lot of CSS variables for people to use, I was playing around with the idea of creating a VS Code plugin that was smart enough to understand which token it should recommend. So let me do that again. So for example, if you're setting background color, it doesn't give you all the CSS variables and suggestions. It only gives you the background color one, and then it also filters. Similarly, if you're trying to set border, it's smart enough to know that the first value in a border is the width, and then solid or the style, and then the third value is border color. And the way I'm able to do this is, let's go back. The way this works is not simply, but is straightforward, because what I'm doing is I'm getting the current line in the VS Code. If you create a VS Code plugin, it has ways to give you the current line. And then I'm actually running the same PostCSS parser to get an AST. And I'm using that AST to learn which property was it. So if it was background color, then I can filter all from all my suggestions that I have in the library. I can filter to only the ones that are relevant. And then I have some smartness for like padding, because you have up down padding first and then left right. Borders should be width suggestion first and then border color suggestion later. So there's some smartness that you can do once you're like in AST land. I think that's pretty much all I have. Hopefully, this was like not too overwhelming, because I packed like everything I've learned in like 1.5, 2 years into this like 20-minute slot. And hopefully, it inspires you to try a few. Again, the link is sid.st.ast. I've included all the links to like AST Explorer, Code Sandbox, so you can play around with them. I think that's it. That's all I have.
Nice. That was really incredible, Sid, and it was. I think I can.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can. You can leave this like this for a while, and or we can remove this one. So yeah, it was really packed with many information. So it was really cool. Thank you so much. I think that we don't have much time for the questions, so maybe we can check in the chat if you want to ask something to Sid, but you can refer to the slides. So yes, thank you so much, Sid. Really interesting concept. I didn't know about all these concepts, so it's also new to me. And I don't know, it's fascinating. We should like to see this more in action. And thank you. Yeah, really amazing. If you stay with us at the end, we will also say bye. Okay. Nice.
All right.
Nice. Thank you. Let me remove. Now. So hi, Ceora. So sorry for making you wait, but yeah. So Ceora, I think we met on Twitter a couple of times, maybe on some Twitter space. We talked a couple of times. So Ceora Ford, you are from Philadelphia, right?
I am. Yes.
Nice. I've never been to Philadelphia, so I'll fix this bug one day and promise that I'll fix this bug when there is a conference.
There's actually a conference here in October that I'll be speaking at, so you should check it out. Yeah, it's called Liberty.js.
Okay.
So
okay, so I'll try, but I've already been. I'll be 4 times in the US this year, so it's already a lot. But I've been enjoying every time I come. So one day, okay. So, but I'm sure there are some good conferences there. So. Ceora, you are an honorary developer advocate at Okta, and you have been also a technical writer for many companies like DigitalOcean. You've been a learner advocate at egghead.io.
Yeah.
You did a podcast with Stack Overflow, developer advocate also at different companies already. Code Sandbox, Apollo GraphQL, also a cool one, and now Okta. So yeah. Tell us a bit more about yourself, business through yourself, and then we step into the presentation.
Yeah, so I work at Okta now. I have a slide where I kind of talk a little bit about the work that I do here. And then, like you mentioned, I'm also a podcast co-host on the Stack Overflow podcast. I've been doing that since, I want to say, September 2021, I think. And I also just started helping curate a pretty popular developer newsletter called TLDR. I'm on there's different versions for different like disciplines. So there's like the cybersecurity one, the AI one. I'm on the team for the web dev one. So that's something I started recently that's been a lot of fun. So that means that I run into like a lot of different content that people are creating and videos and blog posts and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, that's a little bit of what I do day to day.
Nice. So when you want to, you can also start sharing your screen. So today we want to really end this episode with JavaScript. So JavaScript and security, right?
Yes,
so these
absolutely.
are the 2 main topics. So I'm sure that many people will like this. By the way, hi Nimrod. And yes, so JavaScript Developers Guide to Identify Security. The title, it looks very promising. Can you give me like a teaser before I disappear?
Yeah, so I work at Okta, where we're an identity as a service company, and I'm specifically on the Auth0 team. So when I joined the team, I didn't know anything about identity security. So this is basically like an introduction to some of the basic terminology for JavaScript developers that I think it's good for us to know that I didn't know when I first started here. So.
Nice. Thank you. Thank you. So without further ado, let Ceora start and see you in around 20-25 minutes. Okay.
Okay,
Bye.
sounds
See
good.
you later.
Sounds
Bye.
good. So yes, a JavaScript developer's guide to identity security. I'm very excited to talk about this. I mentioned previously that when I joined the team at Auth0 by Okta, I didn't know much of anything about identity security. I kind of like jumped headfirst into everything, and I quickly discovered that when you work with anything having to do with authentication or log in, log out, it's really good to know some of these concepts in identity security, some of the vocabulary, because it'll make things easier to navigate. And so I'm here to kind of clear that up for everyone listening. So a little bit about me. I am a developer advocate at Okta. I specifically work on the Auth0 team. I'm also a React/JS developer. I've been working a lot with Next.js. So I have a couple talks planned in the future where I'll be talking about Auth0 and Next.js that I'm really looking forward to. I focus specifically on supporting emerging developers. And when I say emerging developers, I mean people who are either learning how to code in university or in a boot camp, or people who are within their first 1 to 2 years of their developer career. So a lot of the content I do, the talks I give, the events I go to, the meetups I attend are focused on supporting that community specifically. I'm a Philadelphia native. I saw a couple people in the comments talking about how hot it's been, and Philadelphia is also having a pretty crazy heat wave today. I think it's 90 degrees Fahrenheit, and I think that's like 32 degrees in Celsius, so it's really, really hot and super humid. So I'm dying a little bit, but I'll be okay. And then I'm also a co-host on the Stack Overflow podcast. So I mentioned that earlier too. I've been doing that for a couple of years now, and that's something I really, really enjoy. So enough about me. Let's get into the content. So JavaScript and identity. Why should a JavaScript developer care about identity? If you work with JavaScript, chances are you work with the front end in some capacity, possibly exclusively. So we are building interfaces with React and with Vue. So it might seem like identity security isn't very relevant for us, but that's not true. Now more than ever, it's really important that everyone who works in the tech industry kind of has an idea of the basics of identity security, because security is becoming more complex and also more crucial over time. It feels like every other day we're hearing about some sort of security breach. So these things can cost developer teams a lot of time and a lot of money. And another thing that we need to keep in mind as JavaScript developers is that when we're talking about identity and keeping people's identity information secure, it's very complex and layered. And because there are so many different types of users and different use cases, that means we have to customize the experience depending on like the type of user and the use case. So that means that there will probably have to be different types of different front end or user interface needs that we need to keep up with. So having this security vocabulary and knowledge will help us to do that and work better with the teams internally. So if we want to learn about identity security, where exactly do we start? I keep mentioning how complex and complicated it is. So it might seem like confusing to understand, like, where do you begin? What do you start with? What's the most important thing to know? And that's what I'm here for. So let's start by defining some key terms. I think the most important thing you should walk away with knowing today is what IAM stands for. So IAM stands for Identity Access Management, and this is how we control user validation, and resource access. So a user could be a customer, an employee, a member of a certain organization, things like that. And we are using IAM describes how we let those users validate their identity and also how we allow them to access different resources. So this is like a pretty good illustration, I feel, of what is happening in the IAM process. So a user is interacting with a website and they want to access a certain resource. Maybe that means they want to log in and create an account. Maybe that means they want to change something on the website, change something on their profile. Before they can do these things, IAM would help us to verify the user and also help us understand whether or not they should have access to whatever that resource is. So all in all, this is the key to IAM. We are making sure that the right people access the right digital resources at the right time and for the right reason, because as you mentioned, there are always certain like security breaches that happen. So we want to be very careful about who accesses what and when. So another key concept when we're talking about IAM is authentication versus authorization. There's a lot of confusion with these two terms because when you are a user, the process for authenticating and authorization is kind of coupled together. So it's hard to tell the difference sometimes, but they are different. So let's start by defining what authentication is. So authentication is the verification of your digital identity. I kind of think of it as like if you go to a bar, they're going to ask for your ID to make sure that you are who you say you are, to make sure that you're 21 years old, and et cetera, et cetera. So there's something that authenticates to prove that the user is who they claim to be. Now, we have this illustration that I think is a really great way of visualizing how authentication works. I mentioned the bar, but this is a good one too. So imagine this is a building. Say you're going to the office for the day for your job, and there's a security guard at the door. They're going to want to see identification or some sort of photo badge to prove your identity. And that's kind of what authentication is. So let's move on to authorization now. And this is the process of determining what resources a user can or can't access. So when we have a website, even if a person has verified they are who they are successfully, that still doesn't mean that they should have access to everything that the website has to offer. So this is where authorization comes in. And again, let's look at another illustration. We're still thinking about going into the office and you've already verified you are with your badge. But there are going to be some rooms that you may or may not be able to access, some floors that you may or may not be able to access. For instance, your badge should allow you to check into your personal office, but it probably won't allow you to check into your coworkers' offices as well. There will probably be certain floors or rooms that you can't access because you don't have the authority or the authorization to do so. So that's how it works when it comes to websites as well. So thus far, we've discussed some really important concepts, which already puts you ahead of the game when it comes to identity security. So now we know what IAM is, and we know what authentication is and what authorization is, and then we know the difference. So what do we do next? What's next for us to learn? We're going to talk more about IAM specifically and what it actually does. So we define what IAM is, and an IAM system allows you to control user validation and resources. So what does this look like in practice? There's a lot of things that come to mind, and this is, as I read through these, it'll kind of reemphasize how things start to get complicated. So this is how users become part of your system. This is how they perhaps log in and log out, create accounts, those kind of things. It also encompasses what user info to store. So this is where security becomes very important, because sometimes when you're storing people's identity information, it can be sensitive information that they don't want necessarily everyone to know, especially when we start talking about things like social security numbers or bank account information, credit card information, things like that. So it deals with how you should store that info, where you should store the info. It also encompasses how users can prove their identity. So it's, for example, sometimes it's your email and your username. Sometimes it's you logging in through Google. I've even seen websites that now require you to take a picture of your ID to prove that you are over the age of 18. So yes, it also includes these things. And if there's a lot of different ways out there to prove your identity, and sometimes a lot of websites will require more than one way to do that. And then it also defines how often and when users should prove their identity. So think about when it's been a while since you logged into a website, and so you have to go through the authentication process all over again so that they can make sure you are who you are. So this encompasses how often you feel like users should do that or when they should do it. For example, sometimes like if you are trying to enter information that isn't correct, or you're trying to access something that you shouldn't have access to, sometimes websites will have rules in place that mean that if you do these things, they log you out and you have to go through the authentication process all over again. And then it also, when we talk about authorization, it defines who can and can't access certain resources. And so these are some of the identity access management features that users nowadays are expecting to have when they're interacting with different websites. So we expect to have an easy sign up and login experience. I'm sure some people listening today have experienced trying to sign up for a website and the process is very complicated or it's not working smoothly. And so you just give up and you decide that it's better, probably like a better use of your time, to just not have an account with this specific website or service. So this is why it's so important that our IAM process has a smooth sign up and login experience. Also, we have multiple sources of identity. This is something that I think was introduced within the past few years, but when we say multiple sources of identity, what we mean is if you go on like any website pretty much right now, say Twitter, for example, and you try to log into Twitter, you'll see that you can either log in using your username and password, which is one source of identity, or you can log in with Google, which is another source of identity. Some websites allow you to log in with Facebook, GitHub, services like that. So this is having multiple sources of identity, which makes signing in and signing up easier. There's also multi-factor authentication, which is just allows you to have a more secure experience and have a more like secure gate for your information. So like when I think at one point there were like some vulnerability issues with Twitter. And so everyone was like, you should have two-factor authentication. So that kind of like adds an extra layer of security to any account that you're dealing with. And it also includes attack protection. So there are times when vulnerabilities in someone's code base are exposed. And so hackers try to attack a certain website or database or whatever the case may be. And when a company has a good IAM process in place or structure in place, we would expect them to have attack protection for our information. And then there's also role-based control. So sometimes it gets to a point where you have so many users, it's hard, it's too much to create a specific like workflow for each user. So what we do is we create role-based control. So that'll be like someone who has admin has total control, but someone who's just or even a good example is like with Google Docs. Even though this technically isn't an IAM like process, but it's similar in the way that it works. So if you're trying to edit a document, there's the person who has total editing power, so that's a role. And there's someone who can only comment, so that's a role. And then there's someone who can only read, so that's another role. So that's kind of how role-based control works. So all of that might sound like a mouthful. It definitely was a mouthful for me. I actually need to like drink some water. But it gives us an idea of how complex things can get when we're talking about IAM. And so it also kind of brings us to a conclusion because we've talked about what IAM is, all the different factors and features that are involved with it, but like how does it actually work? So let's start to talk about that a little bit. So we mentioned identity providers earlier. So many IAM systems rely on that. So like Google, Facebook, GitHub are all different identity providers that a lot of websites rely on to allow people to have more options for logging in and logging out. And then we also have authentication and authorization standards and protocols. So this is where things get a little bit more technical and where things get a little bit more, I guess, advanced is what I'll say. So we'll start by talking about the first authorization protocol, which is OAuth 2.0. So this protocol is for accessing APIs, and this is the industry standard protocol for IAM. So this is what is put in place for us to allow an app to access resources that are hosted by other web apps without ever sharing the user's credentials. So this is like the process that is used when we're talking about allowing users to log in using third-party services. When we talk about having multiple sources of identity, it keeps things secure because OAuth 2.0, this protocol is in place, so it protects users' credentials while also simultaneously making it easier for them to log in. Then we also have OpenID Connect, and this is the authentication protocol. So remember, authorization is who gets access to what, and authentication is you verifying who you are. So this makes it easier to verify a user's identity and to obtain basic profile information from the identity provider. So if the identity provider is Google, then it makes it easier. This is the protocol in place to keep things secure and also allow the application to have access to the user's identity and like their basic information. And then we also have JSON Web Tokens. So this was the thing for me joining the Auth0 team that was like the hardest to understand because it's a little bit complex. So this is a method for securely transmitting information between parties as a JSON object. And these JSON objects can be encrypted, so that keeps them safe and secure. And they're verified and trusted because they are digitally signed. So, they can be used to pass the identity of authenticated users between the identity provider and the service requesting the authentication. So again, this is another method for keeping information secure when we're passing things back and forth between a website and third-party identity providers. So all in all, this is what we've learned so far. So now we know what IAM is and how it works. We also know what authentication is, and we know how it's different from authorization, and we also know what authorization is. And we've talked about the basics of authentication, authorization protocols like OAuth2 and OpenID Connect and JWTs. So where does that leave us? Where should we go next with this information? Now, knowing all this, you could perhaps build your own IAM system into your applications, or if you're building a SaaS product, or if you work on a SaaS team, you can continue to try to like do these things on your own. Although we have discussed how complicated it is, and we're talking about something as important and crucial as security. So it's really important that your IAM system be totally secure and foolproof, because this is people's identification and their information, and their sensitive information at that. So if you want to build it on your own, there are a lot of factors you have to consider. We've talked about the basics, but if you want to build your own system, you'll need to go much more in depth to make sure that your system is secure and your users will be protected. Because again, when these security breaches happen, it's very costly, and it takes a lot of time to recover this information, and it can erode your user base's trust in you and your teams. Or another option is that you could use a third-party service like Auth0. So we kind of offshore all of that knowledge that you need to have to build a safe IAM system, and we offer it to you as like basically a plug and play type of situation. We have several different SDKs for different frameworks that you might be using. I primarily work with the React and Next.js one, but we have one for Angular, and we also have one for Vue, and we have SDKs for a host of different languages. We even cover not just authentication on the front end side of things, but also authorization on the back end side of things when it comes to APIs. So it's definitely worth trying out. And we also have guides for transitioning an existing IAM system into using Auth0. So that's all I have for you today. I really appreciate you all listening. You can check me out on Twitter. My username there is CEEOREO_. And you can also check out my website. It's Ceora.dev. And I have this QR code here where if you scan it, it'll take you to the Auth0 Developer Center. And in the Developer Center, you'll have access to a bunch of guides for using Auth0 with your preferred framework or language of choice, and also more information on some of the things we talked about, like OAuth or OpenID Connect or JWTs, which I would definitely recommend you guys spend more time looking into. And yeah, thanks again for listening.
Thank you so much, Ceora.
Yes.
And yes, so I have one question. If you want, you can also drop one below. So thank you for your presentation. Of course, I really liked the difference between authorization and authentication. It's very important, I think, to understand. So what can be like the next step? Because like you explained like many things. So for people maybe who have been following, like which might be like maybe the next step, maybe to implement authentication or authorization, or go further on this.
Yeah, so the next step would probably be to try using out Auth0. I want to leave a link to our developer center because someone just said that the QR code is 404, so I'll just leave a link in the chat.
Okay.
But I recommend visiting the developer center because there is so much information there that'll kind of guide you on where you should go next. Hold on, I'm trying to put this in the chat. I don't think I can. Hold on, I'll just leave it in the chat here and let somebody else.
Yeah, share the link in the private chat. So
Okay.
I'll do the rest. Maybe we
Okay,
can remove
okay.
the QR code, otherwise people will keep saying like that. I
Okay,
can remove
let's
this
try it
one.
now.
Let's go like this. So we will
I don't know
put the
what's
link.
going on with my computer. Hold on, let me try
Oh.
this again.
I don't know.
Hold on,
See,
bear
maybe
with
we
me,
can
bear with
change
me.
this.
Okay, there we go. All right, so the reason why it's important to know some of the terminology when it comes to authentication and authorization and identity security and all that kind of stuff is because having this information will allow you to customize your authentication or authorization workflows in your applications. I mentioned that there are a lot of different types of users, a lot of different types of use cases. So that means how people authenticate, for what reasons, when, and how they do it will be different depending on the use case at hand. So having this information, having the knowledge of these identity terms and basics will make it easier for you to make those customizations because Auth0 makes it very easy to implement our authentication process. But if you want to take it a step further and start to make things more advanced and customize things, it's good to have this information on your side. So I would recommend going to we have on our developer hub, on our developer center, I should say, we have getting started guides for different like JavaScript frameworks. So I would recommend checking those out. And then once you kind of have an idea of those things, we also have a lot of documentation on how to where to store the information that people use when they're logging in and logging out, how to store it, and different, also we have this feature, I guess you could call it, called Auth0 Actions, which is basically how you can automate some of the things when it comes to authentication and authorization. So yes, having this information and then taking it the next step with the getting started guides and then customizing after that is like what I would recommend as next steps.
Nice. Thank you so much, Ceora.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. So we have, I think, just 2 or 3 more minutes. So let me invite back the speakers. Let's go there. They were there, and so thank you so much for the speakers. It has been really a great episode. Thank you so much for bringing so much value on this event. We're trying to do this for free for everyone, for developers. So thank you so much for being part of this. As you said, we have been doing this for a while, 2 years and a half now.
Wow.
So yes, every month. So the monthly dev, that hence the name. So we have to keep with this in this space, and yes, really enjoyed this. Yes, so thank you so much. We left the links to all the speakers in the description. If you, speaker, want me to add more links, just send them me on Twitter or here. We will add them more in the description. Before we close, let me just give a final shout out, of course, to daily.dev, which is the company which is sponsoring and hosting this whole event. It's also a developer tool. We have an extension. You can also do this from the browser. We are doing a lot of stuff, and you can sign up absolutely for free. So you can just check it out, daily.dev. We are also hiring. If you're interested, you can go daily.dev at the top. So we have also the career page if you want. And yes, that's it. So I'm really happy because it's not every time it happens that all the speakers, they stay until the end. So thank you so much. You really made me happy. And yes, so again, thank you so much. And yeah, best of luck. I don't know what's the time there, if it's hot, but here it's like 40 degrees. So usually I like to go for a walk, for example, after this episode, but I don't know if I'll go today. But yes, probably not. I'll skip it. I'll code.
Not tonight.
I'll code some stuff. Probably it's a better day to code today.
Yeah.
Yes, it is. Thank you so much for everyone for being here. And yes, see you in the next episode, which will be, of course, in August, probably at the end of August. And yes, perfect. Thank you.
right,
Thank you so
see you
much.
guys.
Thanks
And
so
see you
much.
around.
Bye-bye.
Probably at some conference. We will try to meet. Absolutely. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.